Now, the next important session, that this session we discuss about Mule flows. You know what is actually Mule flow? As so far we seen that n number of flows we have created. Anything is a flow. Anything that is completing some logic that need to process the user request, that it takes the user request and execute n number of event processor, and finally it produces the output, right, with the help of flows. There can be one flow and multiple flows in real time scenario. And right, projects, if you are working with the projects, you never have a single flow. You must have at least 2 to 3 flows, no matter, depend on the application complexity. You can have n number of flows. The initial flow, we called it as a parent flow, and the next subsequent flows are called it as a flows, provide flows or subflows, that we discuss in detail. First, let's discuss what actually a flow. A flow is what, nothing but it is a connected collection of mul components. For example, let's see this one. Okay, let's see, this is one of the flow. What this flow is doing, it takes incoming request, means it takes the request that is sent by the user or the client request, and it is printing some logger, and it is inserting some data into the database, then converting that message, that data into JSON format. Okay, this is simple thing. But let's take an example of an employee object only. Here we have that complicated thing, right? First, what it is doing, if you look at this flows, right? Now it is inserting data into the database. Later, it is selecting that. Means once you insert the current record, then if you have n number of records, plus n plus 1 records will be displayed. Then this guy, this component again, right, displaying the data in the form of JSON format, and the logger will be printed. So like that, it is collection of mul components, right? All these are collection of mul components. Means it usually consists of an inbound endpoint component, which means when I told you, right, it is from where the message is originated, from where the request is come, who requests this flow, then this starts from here and connect and execute all the subsequent component, all the collection of component to process your request. This is minimum thing. So this we call it as a initial flow or parent flow or a main flow. So then the flow is responsible for the various processing stages in which the mul event goes through its stages. Means mul is trying to process your request, and it is going to across multiple flows, right? You could see this, the request comes here and it is going traversing your request across multiple components, right? Once it completes, once it right, execute all these component, right, then the final output will be go back to your originator, means origin, from where the request is initiated. So this is called the flow definition, right? In general, I told you, right, in application, in your application, right, you may have a single flow, right? Or that basically flow is, if you think in general, right, it consists of only one flow. As we think that, for example, now I'm sending some data, right? Then someone is processing that data or validating that data. It may be saving to our database, or it may be sending to some external API. That guy may storing that data in that database, right? So there's something like it is doing n number of things in between that. As we see that it is like a single flow, but some, if you are doing things right, we have to break down that flow into multiple subflows. Make sure those flows, those subflows can be reused later. That way, right, we are breaking down our one flow, one request to multiple flows, which means an application consists of a single flow only, which means I'm just sending a request, I'm posting a data, but it is saving somewhere, but you don't know exactly. But actually expected it is when you are submitting a data, it is some API is consuming that, and then it is traversing, it is sending that data to some other API, and which that guy is storing that, or maybe it is writing to some file and are doing many things, right? So according to that use use case, and according to the reusability, right? We have to break down our flow into multiple subflows. You can see that is this, if I write logic, if I use this subflow and separate this subflow so that anyone can use this subflow for their purposes, right? Like that, we can break down our single flow into multiple flows, that we call it as a subflows. All, but all these things to should connect together to complete to process our request, right? You see this in production environment or real-time or real-time applications or development, right? There might be number of flows, multiple flows and subflows which are dividing into sub models, right? And for their different exception handling. Let's see this now. I have a flow initially, right? Now this flow is calling this another flow. This flow having a different type of exception handling, and this flow having a different type of exception handling, because the components used in this flow may be different than the component used in flow. In this flow, I have only database selected, and what I could see here, database connectivity issues or bad SQL syntax or DB execution syntax, and this flow I don't have any database related. I have only message transformation or data transformation related components. So I can handle exceptions according to the component that are used in this subflow, which means you can have your own exception handling in your flow, how you have designed your flow. For example, one flow might receive a record and transform data to given format that another flow process in some special way, right? Means if you are sending the data from here to this guy want to process the data, right, from XML to JSON or JSON to XML, no matter what that, it just this component just converting the data from one format to another format. So you can have your own that specific type of exception here. Okay, this is why we have a multiple flows in mul applications. There are three types of flows, as you can see. This last one is not actually a flow. This is just a flow reference that we'll discuss in later in detail. And main flow, I just told you, right? The initial flow and the starting flow is called a main flow or a parent flow. We call it as a initial main flow or parent flow, where the request received from this flow only, right? That's it called as a main flow. And subflow is the one which we call it as a from the parent flow. Means to process this request, it is depending, it might depending on subflow to process the logic. Why we want to display, why we want to break down into subflow, means that subflow will help us for reusable purposes, that we'll see this in the later section now. And private flow and flow references. So we will discuss detail about these four sections in the next slide. Now you see this one, what actually flow, right? We see in this main flow, subflow, private flows are there. And we also discuss that we will discuss about how variables, payloads behave across the flows. Let's discuss about this each flow in detail. Now, basically what a flow contains, a flow contains three sections, right? What's the three sections? The source means from where the request is coming, right? This is the source who is taking our incoming request, who is responsible to take our request. This we call it as a source. And what is the next section, right? Processor. A processor nothing but it contains n number of component to process our request, right? Say contains any kind of components, connector or message components which need to process, which need to complete our request, right? This can be a database component, connectors will be there, right? Or some file connectors or JMS connectors, right? No matters. N number of components and different types of connectors components will be there to process the given request. And at last, what is the final section? Is the last section is the exception handling. If something happened during the execution of this flow, then it should handle the exception. That part is called the third last part, means exception handling. We should
Exception
have this.
handling.
Yeah. These three are the sections that is available to the flow, right? But the same three sections will not be there for each flow. Where it is not available, we'll see in this detailed section. Now see, what is subflow first? Is a subflow has only one section, right? It does not have any event sources, any error handler. Why does you see this now? See, we have a separate component called as subflow, right? You just drag this subflow and you could see it does not contain anything. It just contain only this component, that right, what it has to do and what it can perform, that it having n number of characters, that's all. It does not have any, right, source also not there. Even you see exception handling also not there. Means subflow does not have its own exception handling. It should always depend on the parent when which it is calling. Means subflow always process messages synchronously, but inherited the exception handling from the parent flow. For example, now let's see this, right? Now this is the parent flow. From this flow, okay, I will rename this as a subflow. Okay, now this parent, right, using flow reference, means flow reference in the sense what I am trying to call some flow, right, to his flow subflow, means I'm flow reference means it is reference to the flow, to which flow you are going to call to proceed further, to process, to complete your flow. Means I'm depending on this flow, right? Anyone can use reuse this one, means transferring the message and doing something they can do. They can reuse this one. So and that is why I'm just referring this flow, right? Always just remember this flow reference you use to refer to the particular flow what we what it has to execute after our executing this one. Means every flow will have a flow references to have a common business logic, to have a common reusable code. In this case, you see the flow reference, right? Using flow reference, we are calling this one. And you could see this in the parent flow and the main flow have a exception handling scope. But in the subflow, it does not have anything. If something happen here, who will handle the exception, right? It's always related, it always depend on the parent exception. Means what has been handled here, right? The moment exception happen here, right, it will go back and sit here. There is something happen in my flow, okay, that's why I came back to you. Then you decide what is the exception scope that is defined here, as we discussed here, right, in the previous session. Error scope, error propagate or error continue, whatever it may be. So according to the scope, this will take care of the exceptions. So this will not have any exception handling. It does not have any source also. You see, right? It is just a box. It contains some most reusable codes, right? That's why if any exception occurred in the subflow, it will propagate the error to the parent flow by default. Which means it does not have any capability. It doesn't know how to handle exception, because I'm just like a dummy guy. I don't know if something went wrong, what I do. So I just propagate. I throw the exception. Who is calling me? Means from which flow I'm calling. So this guy throw exception to this guy will take care of this according to the exception scope that is defined here, right? In one, right, a subflow can be called by the flow reference element of the flow. That's why you see this. A subflow can be called using the flow reference component. When the main flow calls this subflow using flow reference, right? What happens here? Then the whole structure, the whole elements are available in the parent flow, also accessible in the subflow, because it is not a like uh, loose couple, means it is different flow, this is different flow, this is a subflow where it is a part of this flow only to complete the this main flow. Means it contains something that need to reusable for other flows also. Then so that is the reason it is always tight coupled only. Any variables payloads available in this parent flow by default available in this subflow. And if you change this variables or payloads in the subflow, the updated payload variables will be reflected back to the parent flow. You can see here, right? But another thing is exception handling. It does not have its own exception handling. It's always depend on the parent flow exception handling. That is called about a subflow, right? What is the purpose of this, right? Subflow can be used, some block of code can be reused across the application. You don't want to have the exception of the subflow separately. Only the parent flow will take care of this subflow exceptions. Okay, that is the difference of main flow and subflow. And next, last is the private flow. We call it as private flow. See, private flow contains exception handling and it have processor, right? You could see this one. It have all the components that we can do as the main flow. So it is one way. It is similar to parent flow, which means it have its own exception handling. Here parent flow also have its own exception handling, right? Here the problem is it does not have a source. Here in this you see subflow, it does not have a source and exception handling, but it have its own exception handling, but it does not have a source. This also called using flow reference. How you call this one? You see, now earlier I'm calling subflow. Now instead of subflow, right, I can using flow reference, I can call this subflow 2 also. Let's see how you do that. Subflow 2 is there. Right now, from here, I'm calling this flow. Like that, using flow reference only, you can call your private flows. What is the difference of that, right? Private flows are same as our standard flows, but the thing is they do not have any message source, right? They can also called using flow references component. Private flows are bit different from the subflows. Subflows is nothing but this one. They bit different case of exception handling or we call this multi-threading, threading concept. We call it these subflows cannot be executed asynchronously. It is always works execute synchronously. Means when parent is called, this guy has to complete, then go back. If anything process, right? If any other processes here, for example, is logger. For example, this logger is here. 1 second, sorry. Okay, after calling a subflow, if you have one more flow, right, until this guy complete this, you cannot execute this logger, which means that is called a synchronous. But this private flows can work synchronously, which means you can invoke this guy, right? Then you can go ahead with the rest of the component, rest of the flow execution. These flows can be executed asynchronously. You invoke this flow using flow reference, you invoke this flow. Okay, okay, guy, you do some task and okay, and finish your task. Okay, until then I will finish this task. Okay, it just invoke this guy particularly. Okay, you are doing some specific task, right? It can be a background task and no matter, right? Okay, you do your task asynchronously. I will go ahead to execute the rest of the flow. So that is the difference. It's called threading and exception handling. Okay, they have their own exception handling. Here you see this exception handling section is there. That is why we can say that they have their own exception handling, right? And it will not just propagate that. Whatever the exception handling mechanism we have in the parent flow, the same thing we can use it here. We can use this try-catch scope also, and we can use error continue, error propagate. All this exception handling available in the parent flow is there in the child flow also, right? But again, the same thing, right? How the child flow is going back to the parent flow, this private flow also can go back to the parent flow if it is expected to run asynchronously. How you can do that? You can see wrap in asynchronous. If you wrap this flow reference, right, in asynchronous, then this guy will invoke and do its job and go ahead with the next processor. That way it works as asynchronously. But the same thing, this guy will not work, because after executing this guy, this subflow, then you should continue, you can continue to execute the rest of the flows. So this is how the flows are working. And then In the next session, we will see how exception handling can be done in the multiple flows, private flows, subflows, and main flows. How these things are propagating, how we can handle exceptions in this flows. But one thing in the last, you can always remember all the three flows can be referenced from a flow reference. Either you are calling a private flow or subflow, right? Using flow reference only, how to invoke it will not invoke on its own. So subflows is nothing but a part of our main flow which we have divided into separate flows. So that is the reason all these flows can be called using flow references. Okay.